Well, good afternoon and welcome everyone. It's this is Louise, and it's my great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague David Kay today, who's going to speak to us on the title of Large Scale and Renewable Energy in New York, Issues of Governance, Community Participation, and Benefit Sharing. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about David's background. He's an economist and social scientist with degrees from Cornell. He's currently an outreach faculty member in Cornell's new Department of Global Development. For about 4 decades, David was affiliated with Cornell's local government program, which later became called the Community and Regional Development Institute. David works in the areas of energy, land use, community development, and regional economic analysis. Currently, he's exploring community and economic development implications of energy transitions and climate change. A focus of his work is on relationships between the local, the regional, and the global. In addition to his academic work, he's worked for many years in this area and volunteered work in cities, towns, counties, other jurisdictions across New York State. He also does some work globally for nonprofit organizations on sustainability, conflict resolution, and municipal land use planning. So I'm really happy to have David here with us. Thank you for being with us, David, and the floor is over to you.
Thank you, Louise, and greetings to everybody, whether I can see you or just your name. And let me just see if I can get the sharing part started and go to the beginning of a slideshow. Is that good for everybody? Can everybody see this initial slide?
Yep,
looks great.
Okay. All right. So I'll dive right into it. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about some policy background and issues, and then move on to more of my own work with some colleagues looking at, especially at the development of renewable, large-scale renewable energy in our state of New York. And primarily going to focus, almost exclusively in this, I'm going to focus on solar energy. So the first, and then I hope there's time for some questions at least. So the first thing to talk about is just this year, there have been 2 major new pieces of legislation which have gone into effect. The first is the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which governs overall decarbonization of the state economy. And the second one is the Accelerated Renewable Energy Growth and Community Benefit Act, which establishes a whole new regime for siting of large-scale electricity generating facilities, including but not exclusively restricted to solar. So no matter what the fuel is, they would have to go through this new process. And I will just, in the context of the theme that I put today, notice the word community protection, the words community protection and energy growth and community benefit. The word community appears a couple times in the title of this legislation, which signals something. I will point out that I'm not going to talk about hardly any of this, but there's a lot of existing policy, which I just showed you one list of all the other legislation which over the years has been put into place in New York State, which is relevant to this, but none of it is comprehensive, particularly as the first piece of legislation, which I'll talk about. So what about this first Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act? It's very comprehensive, so I might call it New York's Green New Deal, to use the kind of terminology that's more used at the national level and also here in Ithaca. But it's pretty aggressive. It sets targets. It requires state agencies to take action. And the key thing, which is highlighted in blue here, is ambitious goals, the 40 by 30 goal of reducing emissions of greenhouse gases 40% by 2030, and then the 85 by 50 goal of 85% reductions in emissions by 2050, with a fully carbon neutral economy, which means is if we can't stop emitting everything, we have to have some kind of offsets, which are allowed, of other ways of compensating for the emissions we do have. Reaching this goal, and by the way, I'm borrowing these slides from a presentation that was given by someone from our Department of Environmental Conservation, who's a bureaucrat, if you will, who's in charge of implementing these laws, one of the leaders in implementing these laws. So there's a lot of things that will be needed that will need to be done in order to reach these goals in all sectors of the economy, including electrification of cars and heating. So electrification is a very significant part of what's going to be done. Conservation is very important, or efficiency as it's called here, waste diversion. But the one I'm going to focus on right now is the deep penetration of renewables, i.e. wind and solar, as ways that we generate our electricity. And just notice that that becomes increasingly important as we try to also electrify other sectors of the economy, like our transportation sector, which currently runs primarily, almost exclusively on fossil fuels, especially oil extraction. Here's just a sense of, not in terms of the deadlines by which our goals have to be met, not our climate impact goals, but this is like sense of the timeline for implementation of this new legislation. Some things are coming right up within about sort of setting specific targets and so on, reporting, doing a lot of things in terms of promulgating ultimately statewide regulations by 2024. Not a long time frame for actually putting in place rules that will have really sweeping impacts on many, many parts of day-to-day life. So there's been a body created within New York that is in charge of strategizing and implementing the legislation. It's called the Climate Action Council. There are two primary types of ways to participate in that. One of them is as a decision maker, and the Climate Action Council consists of, what I wanted to highlight here is just that it's primarily consisting of state level representatives of a whole bunch of different involved state agencies. I won't tell you what all the agencies are, but there's quite a few of them. And you can just kind of imagine, ranging from agriculture to transportation to health and economic development and more. And these are all essentially official state decision makers in one form or another. The other group is a series of advisory panels. And you can see the topics that are involved here to some degree, but not in a one-on way, that correlating back to the jurisdictions of the state agencies I mentioned. I'm personally most involved in the land use and local government and the agriculture and forestry and power generation pieces of this. There's some people that are formally appointed to these advisory councils, who you might call stakeholders in the state in those issues areas, and there are other people more like me who are not officially appointed but involved in making comments to the people who have more formal appointments. Part of the planning that needs to be done is actually developing what's called a scoping plan, which is really sort of the initial work to sort of lay out the parameters of what needs to be evaluated and investigated. Some of these topics which are in the scope are actually in the legislation, but others need to be developed. So what I wanted to highlight in this slide was, and the goal is the scope of what do we need to do to both plan and then reach our greenhouse gas emission targets and our goals for generating electricity without generating carbon emissions. And there's a number of things in here that are in the slide that are shown, but I wanted to just highlight the parts that are surrounded in red, which have to do with the question of just transition of the workforce and the formation, actually as part of this legislation, but also as part of additional legislation that was adopted simultaneously of a climate justice working group and an environmental justice advisory group, with a number of opportunities for public participation. So I'm going to talk about, so this is really about sort of the public governance and inclusion part of what this legislation is attempting to do. I'm going to talk just briefly first about the Climate Justice Working Group. And so it has a formally appointed membership, and the membership is discussed here, noting that the way that people were categorized about how they got appointed was whether they were from New York City, from rural communities, or from upstate urban communities, along with some officials, again, from the state agencies that I mentioned earlier, some of the state agencies I mentioned earlier, who have particular concerns and responsibilities for thinking about environmental justice. And this group, its really broad mandate is to make sure, as it says there, that all New Yorkers will reap the economic and environmental benefits of the transition that is proposed off of fossil fuels. The second group that was mentioned, it kind of has a parallel kind of set of responsibilities, but instead of being focused explicitly on implementation of this new climate and energy legislation, this is a permanent body called the Environmental Justice Advisory Group that draws from community organizations, business, local government, and a handful of other kinds of folks. And it is a permanent body advising the state's environmental agency about environmental justice issues in general, with a mandate to come up with a model policy that would be applicable to the state as it does its business, so long as that business has something to do with the environment. So especially our Department of Environmental Conservation is affected by this. And some of the things that these groups are taking into consideration, especially with respect to the DEC, which is again the Department of Environmental Conservation, when they think about benefiting disadvantaged communities in this context, it has to do with sort of historical injustices of communities that have been have borne disproportionate burdens, particularly of different kinds of air and water emissions. So the goal here is to make sure that as our energy generation and use system changes, that these communities are not unduly burdened at the very least in new ways, and potentially have some of their historical burdens alleviated. So in addition to preventing harm, there's also like the mandate to be concerned about actually creating benefits, and you can kind of look at this type of language here, but there's a talk about the state investing in identified EJ communities or disadvantaged communities, and particularly in energy and energy efficiency programs, but also in housing, workforce development, pollution reduction, energy assistance, transportation, and economic development. So a pretty broad range of investment, and there's now a mandated minimum of, I'm not sure how it's going to be measured exactly, but that these communities, once they're identified, should receive no less than 35% of the overall benefits of the spending that happens in this category. So that's kind of the first big piece of overarching legislation that went into effect on January 1st of 2020. and is the CLCPA for short. The second piece of legislation, which I'll talk about, which I actually work on more directly, is the Accelerated Renewable Energy Growth and Community Benefit Act. And as I mentioned, it particularly governs the siting of new electricity generating facilities. So there was already a version of this law in place, and obviously electricity generating facilities have been being cited for many, many, many years, and there were rules in place. So this is a revision of the rules that were in place already. And one of the key things that it changed was who reviews these projects. So it made it so that a newly formed body within the state would take over review, and that it would be, it's called the Office of Renewable Energy Siting, and it's located in our Department of State. Formerly, the review was done by a body that was, and it's actually, I should say formally, it's still happening because this new office has not fully assumed these new responsibilities yet. So the current and historical review was done by another body within New York State that was comprised of a mix of mostly state officials and some people that were from the area, where two people from the area where the project was proposed. So key thing to remember is this is a state level review with possibilities for local participation and public participation, but the state rather than the local government is in charge. And that's very significant in many ways because we're in New York, what's called a home rule state. We're particularly over land use decisions. Local governments, by which I mean cities, towns, and villages, historically have most authority most of the time for making those decisions. So to take that, so there's tension here, as there always is in any kind of federalist system, about where should responsibility for making decisions and authority for making decisions be vested. National government, international government, state government, local government. So the second key piece, which is highlighted in red, is that this body has the authority to permit all renewable energy facilities of 25 megawatts or greater. That was actually true previously, but there's now a slight modification, which is that facilities that are 20 megawatts or greater, which were between 20 and 25 megawatts in the past would have been small enough, even though they're not small, but they would have been small enough to stay with a local review. So now those projects at that scale are potentially able to move to a state level review rather than a local review. So that's a very significant change in this law, which has been somewhat controversial. There's some other things, but I'll move on. So now I'm going to kind of shift over more into the kind of work I've been doing myself more on looking at issues around solar electricity generation. Just a little bit of sort of context about that for probably, I'm assuming most of you don't really spend a lot of time on this topical area, but there are kind of three metrics I think that it's useful to be able to translate back and forth in. Firstly, there's just the basic kind of idea down there and what's my lower right about the difference between megawatts, kilowatts, and gigawatts, which are, metric measurements in increments of 1,000. The electricity generating capacity gets measured in. So most of us are pretty familiar with at least kilowatts, but you can see the translations there. So another metric is like how much megawattage, which is the capacity to generate, how much of that is necessary in general to to power things that we use. So one way of thinking of that, and this will vary because the capacity obviously varies a lot by where on the planet the solar facilities are and how much sun they get and a bunch of things like that. So in our state, here's one kind of rough translation that 1 megawatt of photovoltaic capacity can supply on average about 150 to 200 homes. That's one way of making that translation. Here's another one, which from as a land use person, I use more than that one, which is how many acres of land does it take generally to site a megawatt worth of solar PV? And sort of the rule of thumb has been 5 to 10 acres per megawatt. I put 5 to 7 here, and it's getting smaller all the time because the technology is getting more and more efficient. But for now, like probably 5 megawatts is a reasonable sort of number to keep in the back of your mind. Here's some mapping that we did to show empirically what's been happening in New York State over the past, really since solar started sort of becoming mainstream in the state. And what this map shows you is the location of residential solar projects. By that, I mean primarily people's homes, rooftop mostly. So they put solar panels on their rooftops. And there's a lot of information that you could go into here, but the main thing I want to show you is the location. And what you see is we're over there kind of in the middle of the state with that orange, with Tompkins County, which has had very aggressive programs to encourage residential solar. And the rest of it is in the Hudson River Valley and kind of along the thruway through the center, going north-south of the state. It's really a map of our population density to a large degree in the state. Where there are more people, there's more residential. And there's kind of like the other map shows just the pipeline. The pipeline map is really showing where we know there is additional residential that's already sort of not yet online, but is on the way. Again, it's not exactly the same as the other map, but it's somewhat similar to the other map. So these numbers become important in terms of capacity, in terms of thinking how close are we now to where the state says it's going to go in terms of the capacity that's going to need to get off of fossil fuels. So if you look at completed and pipeline residential capacity, we have a little bit less than 1 gigawatt of capacity already installed or on the way in the residential project arena. This pattern focuses on non-residential, but still pretty small scale projects. So this goes from rooftop level, not really rooftop, residential rooftop, but non-residential sort of rooftop scale up to what people call maybe community type of solar, which is becoming increasingly popular. 5 megawatts and less is a pretty good dividing line for what I'm talking about here. So these are what I would call small projects, 5 megawatts or less. If you translate that, that's like 25 acres or less. So not everybody would consider that small, but in the terminology I'm using today, that's small. And this shows the pattern of non-residential, existing and planned development that we know that's on the way. And what you can see here is that maybe not surprisingly compared to residential, this is a lot more scattered throughout the state about where this exists. And there's about 2.3 gigawatts of that are either already in place or are being planned that we know about. So if you kind of take a summary of that, what I see here is there's over 100,000 projects between 2000 and 2020 that are either plant already in place or announced. Almost all of these, with a very few exceptions, are very small, less than 5 megawatts. There are just a very, very few that are sort of in the slightly larger category than that. And if you add up all of the capacity together, here's a number you might want to write down and remember for what happens, which is there's a total of about 3 gigawatts of capacity that we're aware of that's in place or on the way. 3 gigawatts of capacity. So going back to that legislation, that overarching legislation, it actually set some goals, some targets, some hard targets for the state to set by 2025. We are supposed to have 6 gigawatts of that smaller generating capacity in place. So what you can say is we're already about halfway to that goal for that 5 megawatt or less. We have 5 years to get there, and I think the state is pretty confident that we'll hit this target. They have other targets that are hard targets, which I'm not going to talk about right now in this presentation, but could address if there are questions. I have 9 gigawatts of capacity for offshore wind energy, mostly down off of New York City and Long Island, off the coast, and 3 gigawatts of storage on sites by 2030. So storage of electricity on site is probably going to be rapidly growing as a way for compensating for the problem that the sun doesn't shine all the time and the wind doesn't blow all the time. So now I'm going to remember that 3 megawatt figure I just talked about. Now I'm going to talk about how much solar electricity we estimate the state might need. So official state policy is we don't really know how much solar specifically we're going to use. I just gave you a target for small solar. We don't have one for large scale solar because the idea is that the market will sort out the mix of technologies ultimately. That said, there's some pretty good estimates of how much we're likely to end up needing. And there's an estimate of about 23 gigawatts total solar that will be needed, which, that's it's an estimate or a guesstimate. It could be wrong, but it's probably in the ballpark more or less, which means that if we already have 3 gigawatts in place or on the way from what I showed you already, that about 20 gigawatts more is needed. So is that a lot or a little? Well, one way to think about that is if you look at the US totals of electricity generating capacity from all sources that was put in place last year, just happens to be about 23 gigawatts. So what we're saying is over this time frame, we're going to put as much solar over this time frame in our state as the entire country added to its generating capacity in 2019. I'd say that's a lot, but it's nonetheless, it's possible. So now I'm going to move a little bit to sort of looking more explicitly at larger scale solar generation. And again, to just give you a sense of scale and context, particularly because I'm interested in siting issues like where should this go and what does it mean about where it goes, I'm going to give you the context of, just to keep in your minds, one of our more rural communities, Lewis County, which is small. You can see some of the data about the particular town I've highlighted there, or Suffolk County on Long Island. Very different context. Now, one of the decisions that we have to make, both in terms of economics and in terms of policy, is, and to think about is, what about the scale of these facilities that we're encouraging? So on the right, you'll see probably what's the largest existing facility in New York State, which is a 32 megawatt facility in Suffolk County. On the left is a 2 megawatt facility. What do we want? To replace that coal-fired power plant, which you see in the center, is it better to have 150 of the 2 megawatt facilities or about 9 of the large ones? It doesn't matter where it goes. Which is more economically feasible, which has better social and environmental impacts if we're going to do this? Key question. People disagree. Here is an analysis that was done by the State Energy Research and Development Authority, and the little chart down at the bottom, you can see like it's a basic GIS analysis that tries to show using the sort of excluding from consideration parts of the state that probably are unsuited for development. You'll see one of the key things, which is all these little greenish squiggly areas. This is where the capacity to plug into the existing electricity grid exists. And what you'll see is sites that are large enough to accommodate facilities of different scales. And what I see when I look at this is a lot of larger sites being available up in the north part of the state and in the central part of the state. Some in kind of the Hudson River Valley, but not so much. So I said there's already an existing permitting process in place, and there's a list of developers that essentially sign up saying they are interested in development of these facilities. And the existing process they have to go through is called the Article 10 review process for projects 25 megawatts and larger. Just because they're in this queue does not mean that these projects will be built. But here is it's not 100% up to date, but a pretty recent reading of what was in the queue. So this is like from the developers world, people who are seriously planning on building a large facility. And actually in this case, I show some facilities that are less than 25 megawatts. Anything 20 megawatts or smaller, remember, would go through a local review process that's run by a city, town, or village government. Anything 20 larger than 20 megawatts is likely to go through the state review process. But the takeaway from this graph is, for reasons I don't have time to go into right now, there's a lot of small projects being proposed. You can see that very tall bar right at 20 megawatts. A lot of projects being proposed right at 20 megawatts. Many fewer larger projects. But if you look in terms of the total capacity being proposed, it's overwhelmingly in the largest size category. So here is a little bit of discussion about this Article 10 law that these projects have to go through and what its implications are in terms of what kind of projects are being developed. So I think I already covered this, that this is the existing law where the state reviews projects of 25 megawatts or greater, that this is undergoing a revised process where the new review body has been formed, but it's still in a process of figuring out how it's going to implement the law. It has not started doing it yet. And if anybody's really interested in finding out more about this, here's a lecture that the state put together, which I could share with you, that goes sort of through a lot more detail than I am about the policy in the state. What I've done here is summarize the status of the 40 projects, of the 40 larger projects that we know are already going through a public review process. So these are, if you will, the most serious projects, because the developer has already started spending money, not only on acquiring rights to the land, but also on going through a legal review process. And what you can see is there's 6 steps of review. No solar projects have completed this review process. A couple of wind projects have. Most of them in the early stages. And you can see the total gigawatts of proposed development. There's about 6.5 gigawatts total in this pipeline. You may remember that we need about, by that one estimate, maybe 20 gigawatts. So not only have no solar projects been completed this review process in this size range, it's almost certain that not all of them currently in the process will get a permit for various reasons, but that many probably that are not yet in this review process will also get permits eventually. So this is just kind of the first out of the gate. A look at what's out of the gate already. Here is a map that we, with our graduate student partner, constructed to look at where these projects are in the state, where they're being proposed, I should say. Again, none of these have been built. This is where they're being proposed. And the green in the background is where New York State has designated special areas that have, because they have agriculture in them, have sort of a special category of some protection, not strong protection, but some protection for those lands. So there's a lot of overlap. That's the main thing you should see there. Here's just one of the projects, one of many projects to look at to give you a sense of scale of one project. This is out in Western New York in Livingston County. The whole county is about 640 square miles. The town is about 50 square miles. The proposal is for a 175 megawatt facility with some battery storage. They are talking about this boundary that they've sort of included in the initial review process is about 24 square miles, which is pretty big. It's a huge part of that whole town. However, the ultimate siting of that, and also you can see from the green that's in this sort of orangish border, there's a lot of green there. That means there's a lot of good soil, good farm soil in that area. However, even though there's 24 square miles in that total area, ultimately the expectation is that there would be about 1,000 acres or 1.6 square miles of land that would end up being actually under solar panels. So in other words, they're figuring out how to site this thing within those boundaries. And there's a lot of land, with a lot of ag land, as I said, within those boundaries. So we did some analysis of the land that was, the land cover that was within all of the boundaries of all the 40 proposed sites within the state at the moment. And this is a summary of what kind of land cover was within those boundaries right now, because there's a lot of interest in where should these things go? What kind of land should they be on? And sort of the takeaway from this, there's a lot of forest land, there's some wetland, but it's the largest categories are pasture, hay, and cultivated crops. How about the actual soils and soil types in terms of their suitability for farmland? So we did a soil type analysis as well. And again, you can see about a pretty large proportion, depending on about 3/4, over 3/4 are in the 3 categories of green, the 2 categories of green and the one of brown that are showing very good to pretty good farmland under different conditions. So again, you know, the bottom line conclusion is that even within these boundaries, which have been specially selected, there's a lot of farmland that is being potentially impacted here. Here's just kind of another take about looking at these things by soil types and the type of land cover that's there, whether it's primarily row crops or pasture. So I've highlighted here the idea that these things are being planned for sites that have more acreage in pasture and hay than in row crops across all of the soil types. Well over half of the prime soils that were in these areas were in fact being farmed, because just because they're on good soil doesn't necessarily mean they're actively being farmed. And there's a little bit of this acreage that is not on the best farmland, but it's nonetheless being farmed. So again, this is kind of obviously through the filter of a lot of concern in the state about what does this mean for agriculture in the state? What does solar mean for agriculture in the state? So tried to take some of that analysis and kind of gear it up. And what you see, if you all, the total capacity that is being proposed in 28 just the 28 counties that these are proposed in. And you can see a very small fraction of soils with agricultural potential or of prime farmland soils are actually affected. If you think that 1.8 or 1.4% is very small, not everybody would agree that that means very small. But what if you had to sort of meet all of the capacity on land like this? So you would need roughly 3 times as much capacity as is being currently composed to get to the 20 gigawatts of capacity that we project we might need. And if we did that within these counties, it would probably use up about, or would impact 6% of all the soils with agricultural potential and 4% of prime farmland soils. So I'm just going to wrap up here and hopefully have time for a few questions. There's a lot of interest in this issue of area about what's the potential for having solar panels and various kinds of agronomic agricultural practices co-locate. And you see here some tests that are being done with field crops, pollinator crops, sheep grazing, some concerns also about drainage issues, lots of experimentation going on in these pictures about different kinds of unusual types of solar installation that are more or less compatible with different kinds of crops, with a bunch of research questions which are not well answered yet. And I'm going to end there and see if there's time for any questions. Stop share. So Louise or Terry?
Yeah, thank you so much, David. I'd like to, enable you to answer questions that come up through a show of hands, but I do see one key question that somebody wrote and other people have said, yeah, we want that answered too. So it's in the chat. So okay. I'm going to ask you to address that one. Pick that out of the chat. And that is, as of today, the U.S. is officially out of the Paris Climate Agreement. But as these solar projects continue, the U.S. is still contributing to what the agreement is set to do. Do you think without an official agreement, many U.S. states can still effectively contribute with their own policies? Or will the progress be slowed down due to not enough national policy support and funding? I mean, this may be a little out of the scope of your analysis.
Well, that's okay. I have opinions.
Okay, let's hear your opinion on that one.
So the way I was phrased, it was an either or. I would say it's a both and. So like, I think it's essential that states continue to press forward in, with programs like this. And I will say that New York and California are probably the 2 states that are in the forefront of trying to do this. But there are plenty of other states that are lagging way behind, and just because we have ambitious goals in New York doesn't mean we're going to achieve them easily. So like, it would help enormously to have a coordinated federal policy to to make this happen. So, you know, we could go into more detail, and some people probably know a fair amount about the different kinds of negotiations going on internationally. And, you know, there is a possibility, at least if Biden ends up winning, that the US will rejoin the Paris Accord. So anyway, it would help enormously to sort of have a coordinated national policy, which we do not really have right now, other than pretending that it's all up to the states to figure out what to do.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, so we'll get back a little bit closer, or a lot closer to what you were actually talking about here. And there's a question about how the projects you're talking about, the ones that are probably existing and in the pipeline, how are they financially supported? Is it through New York State? Is it private investors, financial institutions?
It's all, you know, it's all of the above. Like every developer has their own model. You know, there's significant state policy that encourages this. It's pretty complicated. It's too complicated to go into actually in the amount of time we have. So I'll just leave it at, there's a lot of different variety of funding that includes public and private sector and public sector at multiple levels of government, depending on what they're doing.
Very good. Okay, so if anyone else would like to ask David a question, can you please raise your hand in the chat?
Louise Erskine had a question earlier in the chat. Louise, do you want to ask that?
Oh,
sure.
Yes.
Hi. Thank you very much for the presentation. My question is, does the panel or the body take into consideration Indigenous land recognition, reconciliation efforts, or engage relevant Indigenous nations in policy consideration or land use?
So I would say that that's an excellent question. The answer is not yet clear with this new body in particular. And as I mentioned, there are at least two bodies that are taking sort of environmental justice issues into account, which could successfully, those bodies could successfully advocate to do what you're talking about in a certain way or other. I don't think that it's a guarantee by any means that will happen, but it'd be an interesting to track. Because the reason I say I think there's much more of a focus on sort of traditional environmental justice concerns, which have included what you're talking about, but there's been a lot more focus on which kinds of communities, particularly in urban areas, sort of are unfairly burdened with pollution of various kinds. So that's a good thing to track, and I don't know what's going to happen.
Michael Snow, would you like to ask your question, the one that you put in chat?
Sure, thanks. Thank you. I was curious about adoption, especially of the smaller projects. So the large projects, that makes a little more sense to me. I'm wondering if there's a sense that sort of the early adopters have sort of tapped themselves out, or if there's a lot more, I mean, to get from 3 to 6 gigawatts, as you were talking about earlier, at least, or and is there any incentive program that would help people who may not have been interested earlier to get interested?
Well, I can't really thoroughly answer that. I can tell you, like Tompkins County, which kind of, if you're talking about the smaller scale projects, which I think you are, like 5 megawatts or smaller. I know that Tompkins County had a very aggressive program maybe 4 or 5 years ago of trying to incentivize in various ways at a county level, adoption of rooftop solar through a particular kind of model, which has been used in a number of places. They were very successful at doing that for several years. They moved from a town level to a county level. A version of that is called the Solarize campaign. And they did, however, feel, you can see that we were pretty successful because of the orange and red that was in our county, but they did feel that they had kind of tapped out the potential for encouraging new people to sign up for that program. And there's actually now, instead of that in our county, there's more of a focus, I would say, on heat pumps right now as an alternative, that there's a lot more growth potential in.
Great. Okay, well, I think we've come to the end of our time. David, that was fantastic. Thank you so much. Really fascinating, very current, really big issue in our state and in our region. So I feel
I would just finish by saying we've only seen the tip of the iceberg about what's going to happen if this law is actually implemented. So,
wow. Okay, well, a lot of us will be staying abreast and getting in touch with you to learn
yeah,
more.
please, if you're interested, do follow up. My email is dlk2@cornell.edu. I'm in Warren Hall in spirit, but I'm working from home.
Great. Well, thank you again. I so enjoyed that, and I'm sure everyone else did too. Appreciate it. Everybody,
Thanks, Louise and Terry, and everybody else.
Thanks, David.
take care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.